Hello everyone, welcome to this Azure Back to School session. So this session is going to focus on Azure API Management and its friend, the Azure Function Access Keys. So my name is Joël Hebert. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Azure, have been for 13 years now, and September is always exciting for me. When I was a kid, love going back to school and seeing the friends that you didn't see throughout the summer. So hopefully I make some new friends today, and then we can share some technical knowledge. If you want to reach me, I'll leave my Twitter at the end. And so without further ado, we'll deep dive into some demos. So instead of going heavy on the slides and everything, we wanted to do a functional demo for this session. Just by watching the video, you'll be able to understand some of the constructs that we're going to showcase, and maybe understand a little bit more about the virtualization aspects of Azure API Management. So what we'll do is we'll go take a look here in Azure Portal. So we've got a resource group for Azure Back to School Demo RG, and inside this resource group, what we have are series of constructs here. So what we've got is some artifacts. I've got an app service plan to host that Azure function. I've got the Azure function here, so that's what we're going to create a whole bunch of different ones here. Might do an Azure proxy so you can see how that interacts with a backend channel that you might want to proxy out and make it look like it's part of your Azure proxy, and what the interaction is with the key there. We'll take a look at application insights and storage account. So these constructs are complementary to Azure functions. And lastly, a large construct for this demo here is going to be the Azure API Manager. So if you haven't worked with Azure Function Proxies or Azure API Management and these type of virtualization appliances, which actually proxy calls, so what that means is it's basically before the call instead of directly firing execution to an Azure function or an API, could be a logic app or whatnot, you're fronting it with some type of virtualization or an appliance, we could say. So what that allows you to do is to evaluate some of the security constructs, onboard some users, do some transformations, remove request headers. There are a whole bunch of things that you can do. So we'll take a look at the interaction with Azure API Management and Azure Function Keys, and how APIM sends back a key to secure that channel. So what we'll do now is we'll actually deep dive into Azure Functions, and we'll take a look at the Azure Function Keys and what these are here. So here I've got a function app, and inside this function app there's some app keys. So I haven't created any functions yet, but the app keys are there. And the reason they're there is there's different levels of keys. So we'll start off by looking at the host keys and the system keys. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is this master key here and a default key. So what this host key is a key that allows you to access different Azure functions. So you pass them in, and then it gives you authorization to utilize that HTTP function. But when you're utilizing the host key, any function that you create underneath this function app, you'll be able to use one of these keys to access it. So that means that if I take a look at these two here, one of them you can delete, one of them you cannot delete. So the master one will always be retained, but the default one is there. So if I take a look at what this key looks like, right? So it's just common key. So that gets sent along with the payload. So there's two different ways of sending it along with the payload. One is in the GET request with a key of code, and the other one is an HTTP header X functions key. There's a variance, and there's some schools of thought that say that for RESTful APIs, you should always send it through a post and through a header. And in my experience, I think this is good. The reason why is that a lot of the GET requests, when you go into application insights, and I see this sometimes when I'm using partner APIs, so you'll use a partner API and the authentication is done through the header, not the header, but the query string, and basically it's going to show up everywhere inside of your production log. So you'll be debugging a production incident, and then you look at the URL, boom, there's the key right there. When you're doing this with a header, that doesn't occur. So we're to the wise on that one. So we'll start off, we'll take an Azure function. What we'll create is the HTTP trigger. So right now I'm inside my Azure function. I'm just creating a new one. So what I've decided to do is create an HTTP trigger. Two common use cases for this one: to want to recreate a RESTful API style of interaction, or if you want to, a lot of people use these as backend channels when doing integrations. So instead of going directly to a service bus, they'll go for testing purposes or just fire to an HTTP trigger. So what we'll do is we're going to create a new one. So we're going to call this one HTTP trigger function access key, and we're going to go ahead with the authorization level of function. So under this drop down, you'll notice that there's 3 different levels. So there's function, anonymous, and admin. So we'll look at all 3. So the function level, so we just saw the a function key, right? An access key, but this one here, the authorization level, will be function, and it's going to generate a key just for that function. We also have the host key that we can use for any function, right? If we use anonymous, basically we don't need to send anything, right? So it's just like open the market on that API. So what I'm going to do is just create this function, and we're going to go take a look at it. Doesn't take very long. So the function is created. So what we'll do is we'll click on code and test, and we're going to go over to the function JSON, and let's take a look here at the authentication level. So we have a function level auth access here, and if we go ahead and get the function URL, if I copy this over, notice that basically we've got a code appended to the URL here, right? So remember I said you can pass it in different ways. So out of the bat, Azure will give you this code, and there's a key here. So remember it's called CASF here. What we'll do is we'll take this code, and what we'll do is we'll use something to do an integration test. So I'm going to go here to Postman. We'll just give it a second to load up. Perfect. So there it is. So while this loads, I'm just going to delete all these constructs after the presentation. I have DevOps pipeline that can recreate them, so I'm not scared of showing the keys. I am using Azure Mask to hide some of the subscriptions and whatnot, so no issues on my side. So what we're going to do here is use Postman. So I love using this for simple integration tests. So what we're doing is firing from the outside. We're not testing the API from a controller or testing it through a pipeline. We're just doing a simple integration test here. And you'll notice I'm firing to my function app, and it's passing in the code. And if I send this execution, okay, basically we got a 200 OK. Everything went fine. If I go ahead and alter the key here, so we should get an unauthorized, right? So that should be a 400 series error, right? Yes. So here we go. So now we are unauthorized. So it's telling me no, you can't go ahead and use that. So notice that the value is CASF. So remember I said they're like host level functions, host level function access keys, and then there's one specific for the API. So I can go back to my function app here, grab an app key. So what I'll do is I'll go here, and just to show you, the one that I'm grabbing is the default. So I'm going to grab this key here. Should be able to go here and replace my value. Okay, so now I'm switching it out. So it's been switched out here as well. So if I fire this, I get a 200 OK, right? So I'm using the host key here. Previous step, I was using the one that was created with the function app that's specific just to that function. I can't use that one for anything else, but anything that I generate, I'll be able to use this one here. Perfect. So now next, what we'll do is if we go here and add another HTTP trigger, this time we're going to name it anonymous. We're going to go with an anonymous authorization level. We'll create this function. So this doesn't take very long. Perfect. So here it is, HTTP trigger 1. So it's of type anonymous. So let's go take a look at its configuration. We'll go into the function area here. And the auth level is set to anonymous. Now this time when I want to get the function URL, I I will click on this and let's take a look at the variance between the last one that we did. We don't get this code, right? The code that you have to pass in. Now, where are those function keys, right? So if I go to the Azure Back to School demo and I want the function keys for the app, I want to get the host and whatnot, I'll go to the app keys here and then I'll definitely see the values. I can use these on any of these functions that I've created. If I want to go to the function itself and get that element's key, so basically I'll click on that function, and then if I click on the function keys, I'll be able to see it here. So notice that this one has the CAS F, which was the original one that we had before. So now if I go ahead and create a proxy, so I'm just going to speak a few seconds on this one. So if I go here and create a proxy, so inside of Azure Functions, essentially, it can act as a proxy. So what does this mean? So it means that you can take your Azure Function app and expose that as an API. And if you want to augment some constructs, they can be logic apps, they can be an other function app, they can be some type of other RESTful API. You can basically give it a name. So this would be proxy item, and then the route, it might be something that you utilize for uploads, right? So you don't want the client to authenticate and then use the upload module. You want him or her to basically authenticate against this API here and then use this upload function and then other ways to transform that upload after that. So that's a pretty good use case for that one. So we would say that we want to use only the post value, and then here you put in your backend URL. So I have some here that I did previously, so that's not a good one. So just as an example, yeah, here's one. So it's an Azure Back to School from another proxy function. One thing to note is instead of using this get function here, so we're doing a post, right? We probably don't want to do that here. It's possible to override the header, and here I can do x.functions.key and send that key over this way, right? So that's quite interesting. That's another way of utilizing that key here inside of the Azure function. So if I go to this element here, API management, so what we want to do here is we have our function app. We've called it with an integration tool. Now what we want to do is put a virtualization in front of it. So we want you to go through the API management stack to get to that Azure function, and also we want to add that API to our service catalog, the product catalog. We want to put it out there for discovery for both possibly internal developers, external developers. So we'll go ahead and select here. So this experience comes into the function app. So I'm actually inside the function app, and I'm going to link it to the Azure API manager. So I'm going to click on Azure Back to School demo, which is the name of my function app, and I'm going to create a new API, and then I'm going to enable app insights because we want that telemetry, the metrics, and the analytics that come with it. And you'll notice that it found my two APIs, and those were defined with get and post. So it's going to import those in. So as I select those, it's going to go through this, I guess, this experience here where I can import the function app, and I can also determine what the URL suffix is. So URL suffix is this part here. So what happens is the API manager will stay static, right? Because it's our virtualization. The clients hit here and then they want to hit the different APIs we have at the back. So it's up to us to determine what we want to call this. You could call it /customers. You could call it /upload, depending on what the functionality is. And different naming conventions for these things. So you can create your base URL, right? So some people like to do v1/API/uploads, different constructions. Depends on what style you have and how you want to create your API. So we'll go ahead and create this, and this is going to import the Azure function into API manager, but this is the experience from the function to the API manager. So I usually don't like working in this view here, so I always click on this item here, go to API management. So what this does is it'll take you to Azure API management service. Now from this service, let's take a look at what was generated. So if I look here, there's an area where I can add a new API and whatnot, but my API was imported in right here. So if I click on it, we'll see that I've got a few operations that were brought in, right? So I had my anonymous function, I had my the one that was protected with a function authorization. with different access keys and whatnot. So one thing that will occur is there's an area called named values. Inside this name values, this key was added, right? So if I take a look at this key, okay, so if I want to show this value, a key was generated. But do you remember when we did this exercise, we had the host key. I could have called my API with that host key. We did a function level key, right? So I don't want a key that can call everything. I just want a key that calls just my API. So that was generated, and I think the first 4 characters was CASL. Now I'm seeing 4 different characters, right? So API management created its own key, and it did some work in the Azure Functions area. So now if I go to the Azure Functions area, so I go right here, and let's take a look at some of the keys now, and we'll see that something was added. All right, perfect. So Azure API management usually goes by the the shorter APIM wording. So if I take a look at this key here, so let's take a look. That definitely matches what I have in Azure API management, right? Perfect. So Azure API management created a new key that's contained both here under the host keys and inside of Azure API management under the name values area. And API management uses a patch call, I believe, with a X functions key to send that value to the backend channel, right? So now what you're doing is for someone to call that, you can use that backend channel and secure it that way. What's another way of securing different backend channels? X509 certificates. Definitely myself, anything that goes into production and whatnot, I like utilizing this construct here, the authentication authorization module. Machine to machine, go with an OAuth client grant or go with an implicit grant and whatnot. Something that's quite interesting, and I just want to raise your attention to it here. With the function access keys, there's some verbiage here that's really important for you to read. It says that while keys provide a security mechanism, you want to consider additional options to secure an HTTP endpoint in production. And the reason I'm telling you this is some time ago this was changed, right? If you take a look at some of the elements from some time ago, if I can just scroll right, I think it's right here. So it says, while keys may help obfuscate your HTTP endpoints during development, they are not intended, right? They're not intended as a way to secure HTTP trigger in production. So quite interesting, right? So the verbiage did change along the history and along the path of this documentation, right? So I remember looking at this some time ago and I saw that and I was like, oh, that's quite interesting. And if you look at the Azure Functions documentation, it does tell you to use rate limiting, to use like an appliance in front. It talks to you about different things, and so definitely this caught my eye and I remembered it. So I said, actually that changed. Let me go take a look. And I think this has some shock value to the reader, right? That at some point it said Azure Function keys, in no way do you use this in production. And then this was softened to, you might want to consider different options to use it in production, right? So there was a little bit of a shift in mentality here, but I think it's good to point that out, right? So sometimes you read the documentation and I find that some of these interactions, like the presentation I'm giving now, I'm not going to just read out everything I find in blogs. I'm show you a little bit of real world and show you maybe stuff that I've seen, and this is definitely one of them. I think it's actually quite interesting. Perfect. So on that, what we'll do is I'll go to API management here. Okay, so we've got the portal here, which is used for discoverability. So those of you who don't usually see this view here, so essentially the API manager has different segments. It has the gateway where it actually does the work, so it accepts the payloads and then sends the request back. So usually we'll call that the proxy, and this is the actual portal of the API manager. So if this allows you to do some discoverability, so here, right, so I only have one element, it's the Azure Back to School API, but it does allow me to take a look at different products that are available. And if I take a look at Unlimited, the Azure Back to School is in there, and I can peruse the API and discover things about it. So I can see what kind of operations there is, and if I'm interested in doing a get call, right, I can go ahead and try it if I want. It gives me the request URL, what kind of headers and whatnot. But notice that here, right, I have a subscription key, right? So the API key is on the front end of the Azure API management stack. So in order for me to subscribe and utilize this API, I'm going to give a subscription key, right? So I'm the client. I could be an external client, could be an internal client. But this person basically has to send in that key that gets validated, and then after that, on that backend channel, APM is going to take that Azure Function access key and then send that downstream, right? So there's two different levels of security here. Personally, I would always augment this with OAuth, and if you want to be extra careful depending on what type of sectors you're working in, you can do the mutual TLS authentication on the front end with X509 certificates. You can get some of your customer data on that. The caveats with that is it's hard to manage and very pricey for each of those X509 certificates if you're not generating them yourself. OAuth, though, great integration with Azure Active Directory, and it's usually the go-to. So if we actually go ahead and try this, we'll notice there's a subscription here that we can use. And similar to what we have on the backend channel, we have this unlimited product here, and I have a primary and secondary. And if I fire a call, I'm getting a 200 OK. And I'm getting stuff back from my back to school demo site here. So if you take a look at the trace in APIM, you'll see what it called in the backend, right? So this is what we called in the backend. We call it Azure Back to School Demo, this one, and then the trigger. Notice that there's nothing here in the URL that has a code in it. APIM uses a patch call, and it uses an X functions key with the name value that I showed you earlier to send that element downstream. So this is quite nice when exposing APIs out to the real world. So there's two different ways of doing it. You can expose the function imported in like you just saw, or you could expose an Azure Function proxies that basically is going to front different things. So that's something that's quite interesting. On that, essentially would like to thank you for your time, and I hope that this whirlwind tour on Azure Functions has helped you during this this month of learning, and it was grand to do this for you guys and share some real world and some knowledge with you on some of the stuff that I do in my day-to-day. So on that, thank you very much. Cheers.